The biting wind whipped dust across the desolate plain, finding every tear in the threadbare blankets huddled around them. Alara pulled the worn fabric tighter, shielding the smallest faces, 8 of them, ranging from infants to barely 10 years, pressed close against her, and their slightly older sister, Anya. The 9th, 14-year-old Thomas, sat a little apart, eyes fixed on the horizon, a silent, tense sentinel. The cold wasn't just in the air. It was a stone in her gut, a perpetual tremor in her hands. It had been 2 sunrises since they were left here, little more than thrown-away burdens. The memory was a raw wound. The rough hands, the cruel laughter, the shock as the shears gnawed through her long gray braids, the symbols of her life, her status, her connection to the family she had served for generations. Her hair, a silver cascade only yesterday, now lay scattered on the dirt, discarded like herself, stripped of dignity, of provision, of everything but the 9 frightened, hungry children she was sworn to protect. They were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a small, empty water canteen. The family ranch, the land she had helped build with her late husband, was a distant memory, replaced by this unforgiving expanse. Fear gnawed at her, not for herself, but for the small, vulnerable lives depending on her. She scanned the barren landscape, her eyes watering from the wind and unshed tears. There was nothing but scrub brush and distant, indifferent hills. The sun, a weak, pale disk, offered no warmth. Despair was a suffocating blanket, heavier than the threadbare wool she clutched. She had always been strong, resourceful, a rock for her family. But this was a void. How did one conjure food or water from empty air? How did one shelter 9 children from the coming night's freeze with only thin cloth? Anya stirred, her young face etched with worry. "Grandmother? Are they coming back?" Her voice was small, reedy. Alara forced a calmness she didn't feel. "No, child. They are not. The truth, brutal and sharp, had to be faced. They were abandoned, utterly alone." The knowledge settled deep, chilling her to the bone. She looked at their faces, innocent, trusting, some still holding remnants of sleep in the corners of their eyes. The youngest, baby Lily, whimpered, seeking warmth she couldn't give. Hunger pangs twisted in Alara's own stomach, a dull ache that mirrored the emptiness in her heart. She had to think, had to do. Sitting here, waiting for a rescue that would never come, was a surrender she could not afford. Not with these lives at stake. Her gaze fell on her reflection in a tiny, cracked hand mirror someone had forgotten. The short, uneven stubble where her braids had been was a stark, ugly reminder of the cruelty, the ultimate rejection. But seeing it also ignited a spark. They had taken her hair, her perceived worth, her home. They had not, however, taken her will. Not yet. "Thomas," she called, her voice raspy but firm. "See if you can find any deadfall. Anything for a fire, if the night gets colder." Thomas nodded, rising instantly. His youth was burdened with responsibility now, his small frame holding the weight of protector alongside her. He disappeared over a low rise, leaving Alara with the younger ones. She began to hum a quiet, wordless tune, a shaky attempt to soothe the children and herself. The wind answered with a mournful howl. The vast, empty sky seemed to watch them with cold indifference. Survival felt like an impossible mountain to climb, each breath a struggle against the crushing weight of their predicament. Yet, watching the youngest children shiver, seeing Anya try to comfort her younger siblings, Alara knew she had to find that strength she thought had been shorn away with her hair. She just didn't know where to look in this desolate place. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting, weak sunlight and the increasing gnawing of hunger. Thomas returned with a small bundle of dry twigs and brittle grass, a meager offering against the gathering chill. They managed a tiny, spitting fire, the smoke immediately whipped away by the wind, offering more psychological comfort than real warmth. The children huddled closer, their small bodies trembling. Alara rationed the last drops of water from the forgotten canteen, a futile gesture. Her mind raced, desperate for a plan, any plan. Which direction offered the best chance? There were no landmarks, only endless, rolling scrubland. Just as the light began to fail, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays, Thomas pointed. "Grandmother! Smoke!" Alara followed his gaze. Far, far off, against the horizon, a thin plume of smoke rose. It was faint, could be anything, a brush fire, dust, but it was something. Hope, a fragile, dangerous thing, flickered. It was too far to reach tonight, impossible with the young children, especially the baby. But perhaps tomorrow. It gave them a direction, a focus beyond mere survival. As darkness deepened, the cold intensified. The tiny fire offered little defense. Alara held Lily tight, using her own body heat. The other children were wrapped together, a small, vulnerable huddle. Sleep was impossible. Her senses alert to every rustle, every distant sound. It was during the deepest, blackest part of the night, just before the first hint of dawn, that she heard it. A low moan closer than the wind. She tensed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thomas, beside her, was instantly awake, silent and still. Another moan, closer still, followed by a soft thud. Alara cautiously peered into the darkness, her eyes straining. A figure lay sprawled a short distance away, unmoving. Could be a threat. Could be, what? Fear warred with a flicker of morbid curiosity. Perhaps even a desperate, irrational hope. Who was out here in this emptiness? Friend or foe? Alone, vulnerable, she could not risk approaching blindly. She waited, breath held tight in her chest. The figure didn't move again. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind and the soft breathing of the sleeping children. It was only with the first weak gray light of dawn that she dared to edge closer, Thomas silently at her heels. The figure was a man, face down. He wore rough clothes, a wide-brimmed hat knocked askew beside him. A rifle lay close by, but his hands were empty. He was still. Alara approached slowly, Thomas gripping a sturdy stick he'd found. She reached him, kneeling cautiously. He was bleeding from a head wound, a dark, sticky patch on his temple. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle beneath him. He was breathing shallow, ragged breaths. A cowboy by the look of him, injured, alone. He wasn't a threat, not like this, but neither was he a savior. He was another mouth, another burden in a situation already beyond bearing. Despair threatened to flood back, colder and deeper than the night. What twisted fate had brought this broken man to their doorstep in the wilderness? He groaned again, stirring slightly. Alara looked from the helpless figure to the sleeping children huddled by the dying embers of the fire. She had barely enough strength to keep them alive, let alone nurse a stranger back from death's door. But leaving him, the thought felt like another severing, another piece of her humanity cut away, just like her hair. He was a man of hard angles and sun-weathered skin, even in his injured state. His face, when Alara managed to gently turn him partially onto his side, was etched with lines of hardship. Cade. That was the name he finally rasped, hours later after Alara, with Thomas's hesitant help, had dragged him closer to the fire and tried to staunch the bleeding on his head with strips torn from her own petticoat. His leg was clearly broken, a sickening twist just below the knee. Alara had minimal knowledge of mending bones, but she knew broken things needed to be set. With grim determination and drawing on some buried reserve of strength, she and Thomas straightened the limb as best they could, eliciting a raw, choked cry from the man. They splinted it with branches Thomas found and strips of cloth. Cade drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering incoherently about horses or rain. Alara worked in silence, her focus narrowed to the immediate task, keeping the children alive, keeping the man alive. His survival, however improbable, represented potential. He was a cowboy. He might know this land, know how to find water, how to hunt. The first day with Cade was a blur of tending to his wound, trying to keep the children quiet and still, and rationing what little warmth the sun offered. Cade was mostly silent when awake, his eyes, a surprising clear blue, watching them with a mixture of pain and guarded assessment. He asked no questions about their situation, about why they were here, abandoned. And Alara offered no explanations. The shame of it, the injustice, was too raw, too deep. It was a wound she kept hidden. On the second day, Cade was stronger, though still weak and in pain. He spoke sparingly, his voice rough. "Water," was one of the first coherent words. Alara showed him the empty canteen. He simply nodded, his gaze sweeping the horizon. Later, he pointed a shaky finger towards a cluster of rocks in the distance. "Might find some seep there. East side. If the rains weren't too long ago." It was a slim chance, a long walk for the children. But it was a direction, a possibility. Alara knew she had to try. She left Thomas to watch Cade and the younger children, taking Anya and the older ones with her. The trek felt endless, the sun beating down, intensifying their thirst. When they finally reached the rocks, hope dwindled. The ground was dry, but following Cade's instruction, they searched the eastern face, protected from the direct sun. And there, nestled in a crevice, was a small patch of damp earth, glistening faintly. Digging with their hands, they found a slow, meager seep of water, just enough to cup in their hands and drink slowly. It was salvation, temporary but life-giving. Returning to the makeshift camp, exhausted but with slightly dampened lips, Alara felt a shift. They had helped him, and he had, in turn, helped them. A fragile bridge was being built, not with words, but with shared need and quiet action. Cade watched them drink the precious water, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Over the next few days, the dynamic solidified. Cade, though confined by his injury, became the silent strategist. He knew the signs of the land, the subtle shifts in wind that might indicate weather changes, the tracks of small animals. Alara, with Thomas's help, became the legs and hands. She learned to follow his directions, searching for edible roots or berries he described, setting snares for rabbits using his sparse instructions. Cade's presence, though adding another burden, also added a layer of protection, a silent strength against the overwhelming loneliness and fear. The children, initially wary, began to see him not as a threat, but as a fixture, a silent guardian who watched over them. He never asked about her hair. He never commented on the cruel, uneven cut. It was an unspoken acknowledgement, a shared understanding of wounds that ran deeper than the skin. His silence felt like a form of respect, a refusal to pry into the source of her pain. This quiet acceptance chipped away at the wall of shame she had erected. The scarcity of food was a constant, gnawing anxiety. The rabbits were few, the foraging meager. They were surviving, but barely. Alara watched Cade, his face pale under the tan, the effort of simply moving visible in his eyes. He needed more than roots and thin broth. They all did. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows, a sound carried on the wind, the distinct, chilling howl of a wolf pack. The children stirred, whimpering. Alara froze, her blood turning to ice. A lone wolf was dangerous. A pack was a death sentence in their exposed state. Cade, despite his injury, was instantly alert. His hand went to where his rifle lay. His voice was low, steady. "Fire. Build it up. Big as you can. And stay close." Alara didn't hesitate. She and Thomas threw every piece of precious wood they had gathered onto the embers, coaxing the flames higher. The wolf calls grew louder, closer. The children huddled together, their small faces white with terror. Alara felt a surge of protective fury, a primal instinct to shield her grandchildren. The fear was still there, a cold knot, but it was now mixed with a fierce, burning resolve. They would not be easy prey. The fire leaped and crackled, casting a defiant circle of light against the encroaching darkness and the unseen threat. Cade, propped against a rock, held the rifle ready, his eyes scanning the perimeter, his breathing shallow. Alara knelt beside the fire, watching the flames dance, a symbol of their fragile survival. They were no longer just waiting to die. They were fighting, together. The night wore on, punctuated by the distant, mournful howls that never quite got too close, deterred by the fire and the man with the gun. Alara didn't sleep. She watched the fire, watched Cade, watched the darkness. With the first hint of dawn, the howling ceased. The immediate threat had passed. Exhaustion washed over them, but also a quiet sense of triumph. They had faced the darkness and survived. In the days that followed, Cade's legs slowly began to heal, though it was still unusable. He taught Thomas how to handle the rifle, how to aim, conserving precious bullets. He directed Alara on how to scout further, where to look for signs of game. Their dependence was mutual, their respect deepening without spoken words. Alara found herself watching him, this injured stranger who had become their anchor in the storm. He was quiet, observant, his past a mystery he didn't unravel. But his actions spoke volumes, his patience with the children, his unwavering focus on survival, his quiet strength despite his pain. One afternoon, as Alara returned from a fruitless foraging trip, she saw Cade sitting by the fire, the youngest children gathered around him. He wasn't talking, but he was showing them how to tie simple knots with pieces of string, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. The image lodged itself in her heart, the stoic cowboy, the abandoned children, connected by necessity and the shared wilderness. They were a strange, makeshift family, forged in hardship. The greatest test came 2 weeks later. A rider appeared on the horizon. Not just any rider. Thomas, his eyes sharp, recognized the horse. "It's them," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. The men who had abandoned them. They had returned, perhaps to ensure their task was complete, perhaps driven by some dark curiosity. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped Alara again. But this time it didn't paralyze her. It fueled a different kind of fire. She looked at the children, then at Cade, propped against the rock, the rifle across his lap. His face was grim, his gaze fixed on the approaching figures. He didn't ask what they wanted, he knew. As the two riders drew closer, arrogance in their posture, Alara stood, pulling herself to her full height. Her hair was short, yes, a mark of their cruelty. But her stance was one of defiance. The children huddled behind her, silent. The lead rider, a man named Silas, one of her late husband's nephews, reined in his horse a distance away, his eyes sweeping over the camp, a sneer on his face. "Well, looky here," he drawled. "Didn't think you'd last this long, old woman. Came to clean things up." Alara's voice was steady, though low. "We are not yours to clean up, Silas." Silas chuckled. A harsh, unpleasant sound. "Looks like you picked up some strays. A broken man and a pack of brats." Still worthless, he started to dismount, his hand drifting towards his sidearm. "Hold it right there." Cade's voice cut through the tension. Quiet but carrying an undeniable authority. He hadn't moved much, but the rifle was now level, aimed directly at Silas. His face was pale with pain, but his eyes were hard as flint. "This family is under my protection." Silas froze, surprised by the unexpected resistance, by the cold certainty in the injured man's gaze. His companion hesitated. They hadn't expected anyone else. And the look in Cade's eyes was not one to be trifled with. Alara felt a surge of power she hadn't known she possessed. She stepped slightly in front of Cade, shielding him, her gaze unwavering on Silas. "We survived your cruelty," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We built a new shelter. We found water. And we found help where you left us none. You have no claim here. Leave." The standoff held for a long moment, charged with unspoken threats. Silas looked from Alara's resolute face to Cade's steady aim, then at the children watching from behind their grandmother. He saw not just an old woman and children, but a unit, a fragile, determined force that had defied his expectations. The risk of engaging was suddenly higher than he'd anticipated. With a final, venomous look, Silas spat on the ground. "This ain't over," he snarled, but he swung back onto his horse. His companion followed suit. They turned and rode away, disappearing back the way they came. The tension didn't break immediately. Alara watched them go, her heart still pounding, but the crushing fear replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. They were gone. For now. She turned back to Cade. He lowered the rifle slowly, a grimace of pain crossing his face. "You did good," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Alara knelt beside him, exhaustion finally setting in. "We did good," she corrected quietly. In the quiet aftermath, as the children slowly relaxed, the bond between Alara and Cade solidified. The shared threat, the defiant stand, had forged an unbreakable connection. Cade stayed with them, his recovery slow but steady. Alara and Thomas continued to provide, learning more from him each day about living off the land. They were still in the wilderness, still facing hardship, but they were no longer lost. They had found a path forward, together. Alara would often run her hand over the short stubble on her head. It was no longer a mark of shame or loss, but a reminder of what she had endured, what she had overcome. They had tried to strip her bare, but they had only revealed the unyielding core of resilience beneath. She had been abandoned, left for dead with her precious grandchildren, her world shattered. But in the desolate emptiness, she had found strength she never knew she possessed, and a most unlikely partner. Cade, the injured stranger, hadn't just saved them. He had helped her save herself, and together, they had built something new, something stronger than bone or blood, a family born of shared hardship, bound by quiet trust and the fierce will to survive. They were survivors, not victims, and on this harsh, unforgiving land, that was everything.